Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we are changing the mental health narrative, bringing hope and solutions. Here's your host, Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist.
Sejal Thakkar is on a mission to educate and empower people to create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Well, Sejal, thank you so much for joining me. It's delightful to see you again.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
I hope you can get us started by telling us a little bit about how you got into the work you're doing and what drives your passion for it.
Sure, absolutely. So let me back up a little bit. My background is that I'm an employment law attorney. And so for the first, I would say, decade of career, I practiced employment law, but I ended up specializing in harassment, discrimination, retaliation, and those kind of cases. And I did that for about 10 years or so. And then, I would oftentimes I would find myself feeling frustrated because a lot of the times the situations that I was dealing with, managers or employees were dealing with situations that were, uncivil, harassment, discrimination, bullying behaviors. And oftentimes they didn't know what to do or what to say. So I found myself coaching these individuals more than litigating. And so after about doing it for, many years, when my son was born in 2012, I decided rather than coming in after the fact and cleaning up the mess, I wanted to work with organizations proactively to help create better cultures. And so in 2017, I started my own company called TrainXtra. And what I do now is I work with organizations globally, and I provide all kinds of workshops. I have about 6 to 8 different workshops that I have, but they're all really sort of centered at how do we create more civility in the workplace. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll fill you more about my journey. But it's been an exciting journey till this point.
Well, and if I remember correctly, we were talking about how you had plenty of experience in your childhood of meeting people who weren't so civil.
Yes, I did. My parents are immigrants from India. I was born in a suburb of Chicago called Elmwood Park, which is a predominantly Italian neighborhood. We were the only Indian family in the whole city. And so, we didn't really quite fit in. And so growing up, I dealt with a lot of harassment, discrimination, bullying. And so law school was something that I knew from an early age that I wanted to go to law school. I think my dad remembers it at, 9 years old. He was saying, you were going to be a lawyer, because I was always asking why. Why is this happening? Why are people doing this? Why are people saying that? Why are people treating us this way? And so law just became, I knew I was going to go to law school. And it was something that my dad had started to do when he was in India. And he never got to finish it because when he came here, he had to start working right away. And so I got to finish his dream and complete law school. So I was the first one in our family to actually go to law school and actually get through it.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And so how does those earlier experiences inform the work you're doing today?
Yeah. No, they are really the foundation, right? I when I look back on my childhood, and I talk about this in both of the TEDx talks that I've done from different angles, I see that a lot of the kids that were bullying me, that were harassing me, obviously they're a product of their own environments, right? And the way that they were raised. And so now when I teach people civility and how to, if you see something happening and you're a bystander, how do you intervene? Or how do you help resolve conflict? And when I teach all these things, it would have been so nice if back then when I was going through it, that these kids had those resources, right? And had this knowledge and this awareness. And so when I look back at some of the things that happened, some of the specific actions that happened, how bias impacted those behaviors, how their upbringing impacted those behaviors, and how my reactions in those situations were formed by the way that I was raised. And I saw a lot of gaps, and how people were responding and what people were doing. And especially after law school, when I started working with leaders and now I was defending leaders. So, a lot of people, when they hear my story about what I went through, they would probably imagine, well, Sejal, we would expect that you would represent the victim because you've been on that end.
Right.
Right. And I actually did the opposite. I got to see it from the other angle of defending people who were now being accused of being harassing or discriminatory. And that right there is the paradox, of my journey. And I talk about that in the first TEDx talk of getting to see it from that angle really sort of helped me see how I can help companies and teams and leaders, right? Because having seen it once it's too late as an attorney, but also seeing it from the other angle of being a victim and knowing what that feels like and not wanting anyone else to ever go through those kinds of feelings, especially at places like work where we spend a lot of our time, right? We want to come to work to be our best and bring our best selves, but then we're put in these situations where we're dealing with uncivil behaviors. And so my childhood really, a lot of the storytelling, I use a lot of storytelling in my workshops that I do. It talks about my personal experiences, but it also talks about my legal experiences and the kinds of cases I worked on. And I've seen it from both sides, right?
So when you are dealing with somebody these days, I understand that whatever comes out of a person's mouth always tells me more about what's going on inside of them than it's ever going to tell me about the world around them or the people around them. And so I understand that when I'm watching a bully, whether that person's directing that energy at me or somebody else, I'm watching somebody who's deeply unhappy. They've got pain, fear, or sadness in them that they can't deal with directly inside of themselves. And so here comes the aggressive or the insulting or the bullying or the anger behavior out of them. Do you acknowledge that same thing in your work? Do you work with that in your workshops? How do you approach somebody or work with somebody who's got that kind of bullying, upset, anger coming out of them?
Yeah, I see that scenario, right? But I also see the other scenario, which is really sort of where I feel like we need to broaden the awareness, right? Because in workplaces right now, most employers, right? I'm in California, have your anti-harassment compliance training, right? Where they address those kinds of obvious bullying type behaviors and what should you do if you're in that situation. So those types of behaviors, the harassment, the discrimination, the abusive kind of bullying gets kind of covered in those workshops that are already happening at most organizations. But the piece that was missing is the other side of the coin you're talking about. The situation where somebody has a hidden bias or an unconscious bias that comes from their own lived experiences that they're not even aware of. And now they're engaging in these subtle acts of exclusion, right? I call microaggressions. And these are more common. These happen all the time on a daily basis towards usually individuals of marginalized groups. And it's those situations where I felt a huge gap of we're not addressing these behaviors at all. We're not equipping people in what to do when they're on the receiving end of that. So I cover the whole spectrum. I call it the uncivil behaviors spectrum in my trainings of let's not wait for the behavior to escalate and get to the point of where it's obvious, harassment, discrimination, bullying, or ends up in court. Let's start equipping people with the knowledge, the awareness, the skills, the tools earlier on when they start off as rude behavior. Or somebody makes a joke, they're trying to be funny, and then it's not funny. And it offends somebody else, right? Because of maybe the culture that they were born, or the religion, or their race, some lived experience. So usually when you look at a lot of the lawsuits that I was working on, I'd find myself scratching my head thinking, what would have happened had we coached these individuals when this behavior first started to happen? We would have never ended up here, right? And then what even got me even more frustrated as an attorney was when I would go in and do these workplace investigations and I would start talking to people about the behaviors that were being alleged that were happening. Everybody knew about it. Everybody knew it was happening in most of these cases, but it either become normal in that environment. This is just how we do things around here, or this is how that person does things, right? Or they just didn't know what to do. Because the compliance trainings, which I do, I still offer those trainings. I obviously offer a different perspective on them. But they tell you to just report it to your manager, to report it to HR, basically to punt it over to somebody else and let them handle it. But they don't encourage or empower you with the tools, the practical tools to help you address those situations on your own with that person. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, and I don't want anybody listening or watching this to walk away with the fact that if it's something that you have to report per your policy, right? Like sexual harassment, discrimination, there are certain things that your policies say you should report. Now, those you have to report. But usually those behaviors don't just start off as violations of policy. They start off as an insensitive joke, some kind of rude behavior, a microaggression, right? So if we help people understand that they're a part of the solution and equip them with the right tools, the right language, and actually empower them, right? We can, I believe, and lots of data to support this, mitigates the harm that happens in the workplaces, right? And so when I was sitting there, debating after my son was born, I made the decision I wanted to be at home and raise him, and I started thinking about what can I do now, right? I did a lot of investigations. I've done the anti-harassment trainings. I kept doing that. I also started doing diversity inclusion trainings because I'm super passionate about that. Both my TEDx talks are about, bias and belonging. So those were topics I was really passionate about. And I've done a lot of leadership supervisory training. So I had a lot of different directions in which I could go. And I very specifically focus in on civility. That's why I call myself the Chief Civility Officer, because I believe that the foundation starts with civility, a commitment to civility by every person in the organization, not just the leaders, right? It's obviously the leaders set the tone, but it's everybody in the organization. And that's where I feel like I come in, is to really help everybody see that they're a part of the solution, right?
So you coach people about how to respond in a civil manner when they meet a microaggression or a negative bias, et cetera?
Exactly. So I help people understand that there is a lot of uncivil behaviors that happen in the workplace. And when I say uncivil behaviors, it's a whole range of behaviors, but for simplicity's sake, let's say behaviors that don't align with your organization's core values, right? So whatever your organization's core values are, a lot of times it's respect, a lot of times it's diversity, a lot of times it's safety, whatever your organization's core values are. If there are behaviors happening within the organization that are unprofessional, that don't line up with your organization's core values, then we want to help people understand what to do in those situations when they come face to face with those situations, or they witness it happening to somebody else, even if it's not happening to them. So a lot of my work focuses in on, as a bystander, what do you do in those situations? How can you go about it? Right. And then I also focus a lot on unconscious bias, because that's an area that I learned about really late in my legal career, about what unconscious bias was, how it impacts every single decision that we make, right? And how we can unintentionally say and do things that are harmful to other folks and not even know it. Right. And so I call it in my workshops, when we're in these situations, when somebody is acting on an unconscious bias or engaging in a microaggression, right? What can we as bystanders do in that situation? Because it's not about blaming that person. It's not about shaming that person. It's about calling them in, right? So that's the term I use, is let's call people in and then let them become aware of the behavior. Because at the end of the day, what we can control is the behaviors that happen in our organization, right? When that's we can't control people's perspectives or beliefs, but we can't say these are the behaviors that we're going to tolerate at our organization. And here's what we're not going to tolerate. And if that works for some people, and some people might say, well, I don't want to work in an environment where I can't do X, Y, and Z. And that's okay. But then this isn't the right environment for you, right? And so civility, when I talk about civility, and that's one of the reasons why I chose this area. Every organization, I in my workshops, I share a definition of civility, right? That I think is a really good one. But I encourage organizations to, on their own, I'm out there advocating, Timothy, for every organization to make civility a core value. And so,
And are you advocating for them to come up with their own definitions?
yes, absolutely. That's what I was going to say next. Is that I talk about the civility. I talk about this a lot. Now I come in and I focus really in on the training piece of it, but I always encourage organizations and counsel them on creating what I call is your CAP, your comprehensive civility action plan. Right? I'm doing one component of that, of doing the training. But this isn't just a one-time workshop sort of strategy, right? This is an ongoing strategy. And as the people change in your organization, the diversity changes, that plan is also going to continue to evolve, right? And so, but I was going to share this story with you because, why civility? Why did I pick this particular? Because I could do a lot of these different areas, right? And it's because I truly believe that if we don't set the foundation at civility, then we can't have these deeper conversations of inclusion, of equity, of belonging. Because if we can't expect basic civility in our interactions with each other, then we're not going to feel safe to have those conversations, right? We're not going to feel safe to voice our opinions, to share our perspectives. And so we need to back up and teach people what civility is, what it means, why it's important. Right. And Christine Porath, she's done a lot of great research. I just watched one of her TEDx talks that she did. I think it was in 5 years ago or something like that. She did a TEDx talk, and I highly recommend it to everybody that's watching this Christine Porath's talk on civility. It's a TED talk. Because she brings out all the research from her own research that she's about how civility is impacting the workplace, right? How it impacts team dynamics, turnover. And then what really got my attention when I was reading all this research and then combining it with the neuroscience behind unconscious bias and how people, if they're not trained on what their biases are and how to mitigate those, and you combine the two researches together, organizations that don't empower their teams on how to be civil to each other, like as we're moving into the future with technology and at the rate, the multi-generational issues that are already happening, it's just going to be really hard when you're working with the kind of diversity that's coming our way, right? So I love civility because of the fact that it applies to everybody. Doesn't matter what your race is, what your religion is, what you believe, right? Civility is something, a commitment that every person needs to make, right? And so one of the definitions that I share in my workshop is by Dr. Cynthia Clark of what civility is. And she talks about it from the sense of, because there's a lot of misconceptions, Timothy, about what civility is and what it isn't, right? So I'm just going to share the definition so that everybody knows when I'm saying that word civility, here's what I mean by it, right? Because we can even start there. How would you define civility, right? And I do that in my workshops, and we get 50 different definitions.
All right.
But how she talks about it is, she says it starts with a foundation of authentic respect, right? That we're human beings, and even when we don't see eye to eye or we don't agree on everything, we still have to treat each other with that authentic respect, right? And then it's about coming together in situations where somebody says or does something that maybe doesn't resonate good with you, doesn't make you feel good, makes you feel uncomfortable. You don't see eye to eye on something, right? You're being triggered. But in those situations, making time to be present, right? Which is really the opposite of what our hustle culture tells us to do.
Right.
So full stop, making time to be present with each other because you have that authentic respect for each other to say, hey, let's have a dialogue, not a debate, because it's not about who's right and wrong, but let's have a dialogue and a genuine discourse about where we're coming from with the intention that we're going to get to a shared common ground. So it's completely forcing us or requiring us to get to know each other, to connect with one another, not just let things go, not just ignore them, not just let them fester, right? But have that genuine connection with one another, which is what you need if you want to be a high-performing team. If you want to innovate, right? If you want to have the numbers are just all out there. But if you want to embrace the diversity that's in your organization, and when I talk about diversity, that's another word that needs to be defined, right? I'm talking about we're all different from each other. All kinds of diversity. There's cognitive diversity, there's representational, we're all just different from each other. So every organization has diversity. It might be different from one to the next, but there's diversity there. And so there's benefits to that. We know that. The business case for diversity was made decades ago. But there's also the other side, which is where I think we're missing the mark, is the other side that there's challenges that also come along with this diversity that we need to address. And every organization's diversity is different, so their challenges are different, right? But to make that an acknowledgement that it's normal. We're going to have challenges, but then we have to respond to those in the right way, in the civil way. And then how do we do that, right? So obviously you can tell I'm passionate about this topic, right?
Yeah. And as you're talking about it, I think about Malcolm Gladwell's newest book, the Revenge of the Tipping Point. And so, he talks about how our strength comes from our diversity.
Yes.
And if we try to be a monoculture, we are very vulnerable. We are far more weak than we understand. And yet, he makes the same point that diversity brings challenges with it because you have to have that communication. And when you talk about your definition of civility, I think about a book I read decades ago by Robert Bolton on communication skills. People skills was the title of the book. And his definition for an assertive communication is one in which I effectively communicate respect for myself and respect for the person I'm talking to. And if that hasn't happened, it's not an assertive communication.
Yes. 100%. When I stopped litigating, right? And I was, again, evaluating what my pivot was going to be. So I took a look at all the cases that I'd worked on. And I really looked at them closely to say, why do we end up in court in these cases? And almost all of them was somehow related to communication, ineffective communication, lack of communication, miscommunication, right? It all boiled down to not knowing how to effectively communicate. And honestly, I'll be honest, like there is a serious deficit of people who know how to have constructive disagreements, right? It doesn't have to become a heated, negative situation if you know how to have a dialogue. People go right into that debate mode, and it's all because of the world that we live in right now, So I'm not saying it's anybody's fault, but also people haven't been taught.
There it is.
How to do it. I mean, if we rely on what we saw at home, please don't. It's probably why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, right? Is so that other people don't have to deal with those kind of techniques, right? So we're not really taught that, or reinforced. We might have been told at one point, but we really have to get back to the basics and say that it's okay to have these conversations with each other because we've been told not to do that. Right. And it's okay to say, okay, I messed up. I made a mistake. Or I didn't see it. I'm having a hard time seeing it from your perspective.
There you go.
Right. I'm having a hard
help me see it from your
But
perspective.
here are what the challenges, right? So here are the challenges that I have faced in getting this out to the masses, which is what I'm trying to do. Right. Here are the challenges. I'll boil it down to 3. People misunderstand civility. What does it mean? It's not just being polite. It's not just being respectful. It's intentional. It's proactive, right? It's often dismissed by people as being like a soft skill, right? That it's not important. That's the biggest thing is helping people understand what it is and redefining civility as we move forward, right? And we need it. We need it now, right? The second thing is it's a lot of people, a lot of organizations and leaders have this really short-term focused mindset. If we don't see the result right away, then we don't want to invest in it. And so I always, as an attorney, I'm good at this, data and research and bringing out and making the business case. But that's the hurdle, right? You're not going to see the results overnight. I mean, if you've allowed these kinds of behaviors to become normal in your organization, it's going to take some time. It's not going to be about just one workshop. Again, you're going to have that plan, right? But now with technology, here's the thing. There's really good ways of monitoring. Are we making a difference? There's lots of ways we can get feedback now. So there's things we could do to get faster response on your culture now than ever before. So that's the good news, right? And then the last one I'll say is accountability avoidance, right? If we open up the door to empowering everyone to address these situations on their own, it makes people uncomfortable. It makes people uncomfortable. Like, are they capable of having these conversations? And then what does accountability look like? Is it going to be something that's punitive? Or is it going to be like what I'm encouraging people to do in my workshop? It's not punitive. It's a gift. Like if I'm saying something wrong and I'm on a team, I'd prefer the person pulled me over from somebody from my team say, hey, Sejal, and this happens, it's like, I don't think you meant this, but here's how it might have come off. I'd rather know that. That's a gift to be called in than to continue doing something that's harming other people and my reputation. I'd rather know about it and do something about it, right? So, but a lot of times leaders want to avoid that accountability piece, right? And it's like, we need radical accountability at this point, right? Because otherwise we just keep spending money on things that are ineffective, right? And so I'm always encouraging, let's give people tools. So, with your background, you know what I'm talking about, right? Give people tools so they can start doing the work on their own and try to show up as better versions of themselves. And that if somebody else isn't, how do we let that person know in a way that's not going to make them defensive, right? But that's also going to improve our team's performance in a big way and our own, right? And so it's a lot of resistance. But I also think I'm seeing good things happening. Like, for example, this year, the Society of Human Resource Management, right, SHRM, launched a major initiative in April called Let's Have 1 Million Civil Conversations. So they're using the word civil now, right? And now they're launching this huge initiative. And a lot of they're really, that makes me really happy. That now they're getting the human resource people behind civility, right? And so I'm glad that I'm doing this work, and I'm glad that SHRM is behind this. And so even when I get discouraged, and that happens just in the last few weeks a lot because of what's going on in this country, right? And I start to question whether I want to do this anymore because sometimes it feels like one step forward and then 10 steps back. It just tells me we have a lot more work to do. That's what it tells me, is we have a lot more work to do.
Well,
If people are doing it.
and if you need some hope, Malcolm Gladwell's book and/or his interview with Glennon Doyle and her team over at We Can Do Hard Things, it will give you some hope, right? Because these things they don't happen in the simple linear progression and logical progression that we think. That's what his book Tipping Point was about. And
Yeah.
some people talk about that in terms of critical mass and tipping points and these different things. And so let me ask you to get centered here and focus. We've only got about 10 minutes left. What is it that we haven't even mentioned yet about your work that you want to talk about, or something you want to go back and highlight that we've already mentioned?
Yeah, I would say that a huge thing that I'm trying to do is raise awareness on unconscious bias, what it is, right? And how people can learn about their own biases and to empower people with tools. So, one tool that I would love to share with everybody is the implicit association test. It's an online tool. It's free. It was created by psychologists from Harvard University of Virginia. I think it was University of Washington. And they put this tool together. It's broken out into different sections. I think the last time I checked, it had like 14 or 16 different sections. So this is a tool that you can take to help you identify what your unconscious or implicit biases are.
It's called the implicit associations test.
Association test, yes. And it's free. So you can do it behind closed doors, right? And just make that time to take this test and start questioning, how am I responding in certain situations, right? So that's one tool. Another tool is, the thing about unconscious biases, we don't know about them ourselves. They're unconscious to us, but it comes out in our behaviors to people that we spend a lot of time with, people that we work with, that we spend a lot of our loved ones, our friends, our family members. So ask them. Now, ask the person that truly cares about you, that you trust, and say, hey, you've known me for a long time. You know what I like, what I don't like. When I make important decisions, do you think I'm biased in any way? And then just be ready for the answer you get.
Yeah, try and stay open. Yeah.
Yeah, and they'll tell you, right? So start doing the work of understanding what your unconscious biases are. I just gave you 2 tools, right? And then the third one is simple. It's just whenever you're in a situation that's maybe unfamiliar or uncomfortable to you, you're working with someone new, right? And you start paying attention to the judgments that you're making about that person.
And question every one of them.
And question it. Why is it? Why am I thinking this? Ask why, right? So in my first TEDx talk, I introduced this HAT technique to mitigate your bias, right? So hold off. The H stands for hold off, right? So you make that judgment, hold off, pause, right? A is for ask why, right? Ask yourself why. Stop making assumptions and ask yourself why. Why am I thinking this way? And then T, take action. And I give one example of a rule, the platinum rule, right? Where I say, we all know what the golden rule is, right? Treat others in the way that you want to be treated. And I say, take action, treat others in the way that they want to be treated, right? Which forces you to think outside of yourself and put yourself empathy, right? Put yourself in the other person's shoes. And if you come out saying, I don't know how this person would want to be treated, well, that just means you have to get to know them.
Right.
Right. And so that's the HAT framework that I share in the first TEDx talk. So that would be what I would encourage people to do. Start doing that work. Start with yourself. And that'll ripple out into your workplace, into the community. And we need more people doing that work.
Excellent. Excellent. So if people want to reach out to you, how do you prefer they contact you?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, connect with me on LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm always posting resources about these topics. I'm really, really passionate about it. Or you could reach out to me on my website. And you see the name right there. It's TrainXtra. There's no E in the extra.com. But yeah, I would love to. I'm always open to opportunities to talk about these topics, to train on these topics, to raise awareness on this topic. So reach out.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking time to share with us. And I look forward to connecting with you in other ways. I know we've got a couple different mutual friends, so we'll see how that pans out as we move forward. And I appreciate the work you're doing, and I thank you for it.
Thank you so much, Timothy. This was a great conversation. I look forward to us collaborating in the future.
Thanks. Sejal Thakkar is on a mission to educate and empower people to create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Sejal is an employment law attorney, a 2-times TEDx speaker, and the founder and chief civility officer at TrainXtra. That's TRAIN, capital XTRA, where she helps leaders create positive, safe, and respectful workplaces through customized training and coaching.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.